Hello, friends, and welcome to Spring at St. Andrew. It is my privilege to welcome you here today from the beautiful St. Andrew Sanctuary. I am grateful, as always, to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. St. Andrew is proud to be an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome here and you belong here. If you have any questions about our church, prayer requests for our care team, or if you would like to get in touch with a member of our pastoral team or staff, please email info@gostandrew.com. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the St. Andrew community through our many classes, group life gatherings, and service opportunities, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We would love to hear from you. Just as a reminder, our full Sunday morning worship services, complete with music, prayer, announcements, liturgy, ministry spotlights, and the sermon, are live streamed on our YouTube page each week and permanently archived for viewing anytime. Lastly, to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can always visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. And now let's listen together to this week's scripture and sermon.
A reading from the book of Matthew. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me."
There are certain experiences in our lives that are so momentous, so formative, that we might call them the so-called important firsts. They're the moments in our lives we'll never forget or that others will always remember about us. The important firsts, those unique experiences on which our lives seem to turn, when everything that comes next is unlike anything that has come before. Can you think of some important firsts in your life? Your first day of school, your first kiss, your first romantic crush, and your first agonizing heartbreak, your first job and your first layoff, your first time behind the wheel and your first speeding ticket. If you're a parent, you know that when your baby is about 9 months old, people will invariably start asking you, is she walking yet? Has she taken her first steps yet? Or is he talking yet? What was his first word? Important verse. I'll never forget the first wedding I officiated as a pastor. I was so nervous. I tripped over so many words that I was sure the marriage would mercifully come to an end before the ceremony did. Fortunately, the groom had been married twice before, and he just coached me right through the entire ceremony. But every pastor knows there are important firsts, unlike one in particular. The first sermon, that's the most important. It tops them all. Pastors should never, ever underestimate the importance of a first sermon. You can only make a first impression once, and the same is true of your first sermon. It's a defining moment in a new church. After you preach, people will be asking each other, so what do you think about the new preacher? The stakes are pretty high when it comes to that first sermon, which is why the Gospel of Matthew devotes 3 whole chapters to the first sermon Jesus ever preached. It was such an important first sermon that over the years we've actually given it a name, the Sermon on the Mount. And some say it's the best sermon ever preached. In fact, it opens with what's come to be known as the so-called Beatitudes, which are so popular that a lot of people actually stitch them in needlepoint and hang them on kitchen walls. You've heard them. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart. They're the first words of the first sermon that Jesus ever preached. And while they've brought great comfort to many people over the centuries, they probably confounded most of the people who first heard Jesus preach them on that day in the mountains. Why? Well, because what Jesus calls the blessed life is pretty far from what they, or even we today, would ever consider to be anything like a blessing. Today, people might say, I've been blessed with great health or good looks, or I've been blessed with this great paying job, or with my success or prosperity, or my notoriety or achievements. Have you ever noticed that when everything's going our way, and the sun is shining down on us, and the wind is at our back, we tend to describe our lives as blessed? It's not entirely wrong to feel this way. In fact, if you read Hebrew Scripture, especially the book of Deuteronomy, this kind of prosperity theology is everywhere. It says, keep the commandments and you'll be blessed with many children and green pastures, abundant crops and overflowing granaries. Keep the covenant, follow the Torah, do what's right, and God will bless you with good health, a long life, much laughter, many friends, and lots of cattle and goats and grandchildren. This is what the Hebrews believed, and there is a thread of truth that runs through it, at least in the sense that everything good in our lives really is a gift from God. And life itself is windfall. And Jesus came that, as he said, we might have life and have it abundantly. And how can we not get out of bed every day of our lives without saying to God, wow, and thank you? Our problem is not that we believe that good fortune really is God's blessing. Our problem is understanding that the inevitable moments in our lives when we truly experience scarcity or neediness, vulnerability or tragedy, misfortune or deep loss, our problem is believing that these are not signs of God's curse. I've sat with so many people over the years who, upon experiencing some kind of misfortune or illness or some kind of tragic accident, who have asked that awful, unanswerable question, what did I do to deserve this? It's a question, I think, as old as time itself. Did I do something wrong? Is God punishing me? Jesus understood that when our faith becomes transactional and we begin to perceive good fortune as God's reward and misfortune as God's punishment or curse, we end up turning God into something like a divine vending machine into which we drop our prayers and good deeds like coins, expecting to get some kind of snack-sized blessing in return. Which is why the first sermon Jesus ever preached was so momentous, even earth-shattering, because he turned this transactional theology on its head. And he taught that all those people whom the world considers cursed simply because of their apparent misfortune or the absence of prosperity in their lives, these people, said Jesus, are actually blessed because they long for so much more than a vending machine concession. They long for peace and righteousness, mercy, and, as he called it, the kingdom of heaven. To understand the Beatitudes, we have to approach them with a beginner's mind, unclouded by our cultural beliefs and assumptions. Most of us struggle to understand these teachings and the Beatitudes because we try to fit them into our existing agendas and our modern conventions. Which is why when Jesus begins his sermon by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," it's really hard to understand the logic of that. Another translation of the Greek word for blessed is simply happy. Happy are the poor in spirit, he says. And we say, really? Unless this is actually some kind of joke, it's a really bad opening line to your very first sermon. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Can you right now conjure an image in your mind of the poor in spirit? Is it someone heavy with worry and weariness and sadness? Is it someone in whom the light has just faded or died? Someone who is devoid of joy? Jesus says this person is blessed or happy. What Jesus means here by poor in spirit is not someone who's necessarily sad or depressed or hopeless. Poor in spirit really means this inner humility, a beginner's mind, a mindset that's absent of self-righteousness or arrogance or self-sufficiency. Poor in spirit is something like what Alcoholics Anonymous describes in the very first step. It's the admission that one is powerless. The Greek word that Matthew uses for poor is tokoi. It literally means something like the very empty ones, those who are crouching. They're the slumping beggars, the invisible nobodies of this world who have nothing left, who aren't self-preoccupied or full of themselves in any way. Jesus is saying, happy are you because you're the freest of all. It sounds utterly counterintuitive to think that the crouched over, the slumping over, the invisible ones could actually be more free than those like us, perhaps, who are visible and esteemed and accomplished and standing rather tall. But Jesus wasn't romanticizing the lived experience of some old man dressed in rags, pushing his rusty shopping cart of recycled cans down the city street. Maybe instead, by pointing to the empty ones, Jesus is simply inviting the rest of us to look inward at ourselves, at all the ways we fill ourselves with stuff we don't need or things that don't satisfy, all the ways we numb our deep longings with our shallow belongings, and how the things that we own can end up owning us if we let them, which then always leads to a very unhappy life. Happy are the empty ones, for they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven, says Jesus. But for those who are not so empty, maybe what he really means is unhappy, are the ones so overstuffed and self-satisfied that there's just no room left within them to inherit the kingdom. Maybe this is a call to let go and to empty ourselves so that we can receive. I once knew a woman who would have made Jesus' list of blessed ones. She was 80 years old when she first joined my church years ago. And for 4 years, she never missed a Sunday until she suffered a stroke, after which she became homebound. Paralysis on her left side made it impossible to walk or to speak. Over the next few years, I would go to her home to visit. We'd watch the squirrels scamper along the brick wall in her backyard and the hummingbirds dance at the feeder. And she would communicate with me through these written messages on a small green notepad in the shaky handwriting of her old age. She'd write, and I'd read, and then comment, and she would respond in writing. This was how we talked. Then the time came that she was physically unable to eat food, and she made this decision to forego the feeding tube that might have prolonged her life. On her small green notepad, she wrote the following words one day, which I'll never forget. Can't walk, can't eat, can't talk. She showed me the notepad, and I nodded. Then she wrote the most curious words of all. I am blessed. I paused to reflect on the strange logic of that statement. Can't walk, can't eat, can't talk. I am blessed. And I knew in that moment that here was this living, breathing beatitude of Jesus. She possessed nothing, but possessed everything. And who doesn't long for that kind of freedom? Blessed are the empty ones. Happy are the powerless ones, the poor, the tokoi. But it's not just the ones who possess nothing who are most free, says Jesus. Tokoi in the Greek, that means not just those who are empty of possessions. It also refers to those who are empty of ego, presumption, self-preoccupation, which is why in our passage from Matthew 18 today, Jesus says, unless you become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Children are free from all that which tends to bind us as adults. Presumption, pride, ego, a sense of self-sufficiency, the obsession over winning and losing, the worries about what tomorrow might bring. But maybe most of all, children are free from all the labels we're apt to wear as we grow older. All the labels that define us and constrain us and bind us and conceal the true self within us. The great mystic Thomas Merton spoke of these labels as the false self. And he said the false self is the persona that we project to the world. It's the person we try to be that doesn't think it needs God's guidance or God's love. The false self is an amalgam of all the values and expectations that our world projects onto us. Our culture, education, gender, job, politics, families, achievements. The world tells us who we're supposed to be, what will get us noticed, how we'll get affirmation or validation. And so we, over the course of our lives, wrap ourselves in all these labels. Christian, American, male, female, straight, gay, Democrat, Republican, preacher, nurse, teacher, skinny, smart, blonde, educated, successful, wealthy. All these labels stick to us. They help us get through life, actually, and they're very useful. They lead to great jobs and to wonderful love and to belonging and influence and status. And so we start to think that's who we really are. The problem is that these labels have a shadow side. Because if they become our sole identity, we'll do anything to keep them. We might become striving or pretentious, clingy, manipulative, or deceptive. If successful is our chosen label, we might bend the rules or cut corners or undercut others to climb the ladder. If rich is our chosen label, we might cheat or steal to get ahead. If best mom or dad ever is our chosen label, we might drive our kids to overachieve, or we might resort to helicopter or snowplow parenting tactics. We will, in other words, become whatever is necessary in the moment to get that validation until we can no longer remember who we really are. And so Jesus says, blessed are the empty ones. Happy are the tokoi, the ones without labels who are free to inherit true life. James Fenley, in his recent book, The Healing Path, tells this story taken from the tradition of the desert fathers and mothers. In the first centuries of the church, men and women would go into the desert to undergo a dying, so to speak, to all that hindered them from experiencing the promises of Christ. Men and women from the surrounding villages would then come to the desert mothers and fathers to seek from them a message, to be awakened to a deeper realization of God's presence in their lives. In one story, a Christian hermit hears a knock at the door of his hermitage. And he opens the door and sees a mother and father and their young daughter. The parents say they've come to ask him to pray over their daughter, who they say has been turned into a donkey by this evil wizard. And the hermit says, "I see," as he invites them to come inside. The hermit then asks the parents to sit off to one side as he asks the little girl if she's hungry, whether she would like something to eat. And when she says she'd like that, the hermit talks to her as he prepares her a meal. He asks her questions about all the things that matter most to her. And when the parents see the genuine love with which the hermit relates to their daughter, their eyes are opened. And they suddenly realize that the wizard had not cast a spell on their daughter, turning her into a donkey. Rather, the wizard had cast a spell on them, leading them to believe their daughter was a donkey. And in seeing that their daughter is truly the little girl they love, they are filled with joy and tearfully embrace the girl. As the parents leave with their daughter, they express gratitude for what has just happened. And their daughter, according to the story, is grateful as well. Because, after all, it's hard being a little girl when your parents think you're a donkey. And it's especially hard when you start to believe that you are the donkey your parents believe you to be. Blessed are the poor in spirit, says Jesus, the empty ones of possessions that enslave, the ones free from the labels of the false self, the ones who have enough and are enough, and whose hearts and hands are open enough to inherit all that God longs to give them. The takeaways for today: life is windfall, but misfortune is never God's punishment. To be blessed is to be free. And we have enough, and we are enough to inherit the kingdom today.